Greetings, Acolyte, and welcome back to the Ordo Grigio, the Emperor's secret society against the enemy that is unpainted models. Today I'm going to show you how I kitbashed my regiment for Turnip 28. With any project, I always like to start with some prototype models which help me really visualise where I'm going and sort of refine the process, especially if I'm going to be doing it for quite a few models. The models you can see here are those two prototypes for my Turnip Regiment. The one on screen now is a fodder model, used combining the STL files from the Patreon and some models that we'll cover later. This other guy here is one of the preliminary snobs for my army, where I've done the same techniques, however I've used the torso from a Death Corps of Kriegsmen from 40k. After printing off the torso STL files that were available for free, I decided to grab onto these sprues. These come from Perry Miniatures, and they are the Napoleonic Line Infantry Battalion. They come in a box of 44, which is much more than I need for my regiment, so I've got plenty of spares left over, as I did also use the Agincourt Foot Knights kit as well, so I had a total of 70 models, and the entire buy-in was around £50 or £60 so far. As well as these models, I did also buy individual bases, as I wanted my guys to be able to be removed as casualties, though Turnip does allow multi-basing. To start it off, I decide how many models I'm going to do, and start clipping the bases out of the sprue. I decided, after doing my prototypes, that it would be better to do them in stages and do them by squad, as this would also help me not get totally lost in the process, and get carried away doing loads of one thing and not enough of another. With the bases clipped off the sprue, I took a small hobby knife and trimmed away the flash where it connected to the sprue. I use a mixture of a cutting and a scraping motion just to smooth it out, so that once it's all painted, you can barely tell where it was removed from the sprue. Once all the bases are removed and cleaned up, and in a nice neat little pile, it's time to grab hold of our Napoleonic infantry. Now, much like the bases, they're on a sprue, so we follow the same process of clipping through all the little tabs that hold them on, and then popping them off. As I'm doing a batch of models, I work my way up the sprue on one part, and then back down it on another, just to save a little bit of time on the changeovers between the different models. And it's small things like this that really help speed up a large build, where you get carried away and build an entire regiment. Though for now we'll just focus on getting the torsos out the sprue and onto the desk so that we can move on to the next step. Once all the torsos are removed, we can have a look, and you may have realised these have a torso and I have 3D printed ones. So out come the pliers, and just below the tab where the backpack connects, it's time to just crunch through that torso, get it removed, and then repeat another 10 times. Once all 10 are done, I dry fit the torsos on, and inevitably it will need a little bit of smoothing and finagling of the angle. So out comes the knife just to trim each individual model so that the torso I've chosen fits nice enough that once we fill the gaps with super glue, it won't have a massively horrendous gap. After all, Turnip is quite a laissez-faire game when it comes to the models, and I know that there's going to be another stage later which will help hide this gap. So I'm not being too precise, I just want the angle of the torso right. Once I'm happy with the angle, it's time to bring out the super glue. I'm using gel super glue here to help fill those gaps, and applying it generously to where the joint is, and just sit the torso in place, give it a couple of seconds to firm up so it holds its own weight, and we have our first Turnip torso applied to the legs. And now it's just time to do it another 10 times. With the glue dried and the torsos attached, I can move my attention down to the base. Now these models from Perry come with little stands that help when you're multi-basing the models to give them a bit more grip onto the surface you glue them to. However, I'm single basing my models, so out come the clippers so that I can start working my way around the feet and just snipping off the excess initially. I'm not trying to get right in there straight away because there's a lot of material to move compared to the size of the model's feet. However, on the flip side, I know later on I'm going to be doing some mod effects, so this doesn't have to be perfect. Once the majority of the material is removed, I can start coming in from the bottom and slowly shaving it away, working my way down to roughly where the feet are. But again, there will be some mod effects, so this doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to not prop the model up a ridiculous amount. Once I'm happy with the little stand that's left, the super glue comes back out, and then I can stick the model to its base. Here you can use hard plastic glue like polystyrene cement, however as I was using super glue for the torsos, I didn't fancy buying any more glue, so just kept with that. Once the glue's dried, it's time to move on to the backpacks. The first step is to remove the little tab that locates it into the original infantryman's back, as that's what we used as a guide to cut them off earlier. To achieve this, I first used some clippers to remove the bulk of the tab, and then come in with my knife to just scrape away the rest. Just enough that it fits onto the torso, as again there will be a step which helps hide this gap. What we're looking for is enough conformance to the shape so that we can get a good strong bond with the super glue. At this stage I also remove any mould lines or flash left from cutting it off the sprue, so that when we paint the model there isn't strange lines just running across smooth objects or random squares sticking out of fabric. As we've changed the torso we're using, the shape doesn't quite line up perfectly, so I do add a little bend to where the backpack joins onto the tails of the jacket, just to help it, bringing it closer in line to the silhouette of the model we're creating. As with any Kitbash project, dry fitting is quite important, because it's a lot easier to take a part away when it doesn't have any super glue holding it there than it is once you've started gluing it in place. So I make sure I'm happy with the fit and that the backpack goes onto the torso before I start gluing it on, and I do this with each individual model. Once each of my fodder have a backpack for storing all their gubbins, it's time to move on to the next step, which will be gluing on the arms. For these I decided I wanted to have black powder weapons, not only because they came on the same sprue as the bodies I used, but also I've never played a tabletop game which had muskets, so I want to put them on. And definitely not because I watched a lot of Sharp as a kid.
I want that flag! Who's with me?
Much like the other parts, I start by removing it from the sprue with my clippers, before coming in and tidying it up with my knife, removing any extra flash or mould lines that I can see on the model. This is where the differences in the scale between Perry miniatures and Games Workshop miniatures are really apparent, and that's in the weapons and the hands. Where Games Workshop uses heroic 28, leaning more towards 32mm scale, Perry is a realistic 28, so the barrels of the weapons, the blades of the bayonets, and the hands are much smaller on the Perry miniatures than the Games Workshop ones. Although, weirdly enough, it did still match the Krieg torso I had, so I was quite happy with that. Once removed from the sprue and cleaned up, it's much the same as fitting it to any other torso, as these STL files were designed to work with the Perry miniatures. So once again I just apply super glue to the joints and then press them into place. These torsos seem to be just a little bit wider than the Perry miniature torsos however, which means it is a bit of a fiddle to get the two-handed poses correct. Though with a bit of super glue and a bit of patience, it's easily achievable. Though I do advise gluing both arms at the same time, rather than waiting for them to dry, so that you can move them whilst they're drying. Now they're both armed and, well, armed, it's time to get out some little tufts of static grass to add in those little rooty tendrils. On their own they're quite large and would probably overpower the model, so I get my scissors out and start cutting the tufts into strips. On my test model I found that about a quarter of a tuft on each side of the model was just right, so that it'd be just sticking out from the torso, but not take up the entire model. After prepping the tufts, it's time to start getting the models out, as well as the super glue. Whilst the static graph tufts did come with a sticky backing, I wasn't 100% convinced that it would hold them permanently to the model, especially since I knew I was going to be dry brushing them when I painted them. So on each part where the sticky pad was, I applied a dollop of super glue just to help it stick to the model on a long-term basis. Then, keeping the tufts pointing outwards, I glued it into the gap between the arm and the backpack before pressing it in and roughly shaping it with the back blunt side of my knife. Once the tufts were in place, I came back in with the scissors and just sort of trimmed any edges that were sticking out too far. The step isn't very necessary, I just felt that it improved the model and would mean that they weren't just flopping about when I went to paint them. With the tufts glued and trimmed, that's the construction or kitbash of the models done, and all that's left to do is the basing. However, in between finishing building my fodder and basing them, I got a little carried away. Ended up making a unit of brutes with melee weapons, a unit of brutes with black powder weapons, a toff out of an old Inquisitor model from 40k, 3D printing a multi-barreled cannon, and some root vegetable loving degenerates to crew it. To base these models, I wanted a really churned up mud texture, and on my test model I used just hole filler for the walls. However, I found that mixing some coarse construction sand in really helped the texture. So once I'd mixed them together in a ratio that is 100% scientific and not just wild guesswork, I took a broken stirring stick and started scooping it onto the base. With this step I didn't have to be particularly careful, as I did want the models to feel like they were trudging through the mud. So if I got any up onto the boots or onto the legs, we could just paint them up in the same colour as the mud later on, and it would look like they'd been through the environment. One thing I did notice while using this hole filler and sand mix is that it does start to dry and cure quite quick, so mixing small batches of it is probably better when you're doing big projects like this, so that it doesn't dry out on the stick or on the lid that I was using as a palette. However, the quick drying time is also a bonus in that it allows me to go from kit bashing and building to painting fairly quick, and I don't have to wait hours for resin or any other medium to dry. And it is also a lot cheaper and comes with its own texture. Then, once they're all dried and primed, they then look a bit like this. So that's how I built my regiment for Turnip 28, though I think I'm far from done with this weird and wonderful miniature game. If you want to see how I painted them up, check out last week's video, which will be linked in the description below. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear what you think down in the comment section below, and I'll see you all next time.